Hello, I'm John Gooch. I'm Professor of International History at the University of Leeds, and my specialism is the history of war in the 19th and 20th centuries, and particularly the military history of Italy. And I'm going to talk about Mussolini, the armed forces, and war in the fascist regime between 1922 and 1940. When Mussolini came to power in 1922, he was a bellicose man with very clear objectives, and those objectives he saw would involve war sooner or later. After all, struggle was one key part of the fascist party doctrine that he espoused. But Mussolini had very clear ambitions, both local and regional, and those ambitions required a strong military force in order to achieve them. Very briefly, the ambitions were, first of all, territorial. Mussolini wanted, and eventually got, Trieste, Fiume, and he wanted the Dalmatian coast on the east side of the Adriatic. More broadly, Mussolini wanted regional influence, and that meant power in the eastern Mediterranean particularly, and also in the western Mediterranean. If he could get it, thirdly, he would have liked to have had a power caucus surrounding him in the Danube basin as well. Now that fact identifies two of Mussolini's long-lasting enemies. The first was the French. Mussolini viscerally loathed the French, and as we'll see, the potential for war with France threaded the history of the 1920s and 30s as far as fascism and Mussolini were concerned. The other opponent at the other end of the Mediterranean was Yugoslavia. Equally, Mussolini and others of his hierarchy loathed Slavs. And one thing that Mussolini wanted to do, really from the middle of the 1920s onwards, was settle the hash of the Yugoslavs. He never actually achieved it, but he wanted to do it. The third thing that Mussolini wanted was an autonomous international position, and that too required demonstrable power in terms of the armed forces, the army, the navy, and the air force. And finally, we can say, by way of introduction, that we know from the early stages of his career that Mussolini was ready to try war. He did so on at least 4 occasions, and possibly on a 5th. In February 1923, scarcely in office, he wanted the army and navy to encourage Italian separatists on the French-controlled island of Corsica, but didn't get that. In September 1923, briefly, the navy seized the island of Corfu off Greece for him before international intervention forced him to withdraw. Then, almost straight away, fascist Italy seized Fiume. And fourthly, we know that in May and June of 1924, Mussolini was contemplating a war against Turkey. There's also tantalizingly fragmentary evidence that he was thinking of a war again against Turkey in 1926. The object on both of these occasions was to claim a slice of what is now Iraqi territory. Mussolini's way of imagining how he would resolve the problems facing Italy and gain the territories and possessions that he wanted. In order to be a masterful figure on the European stage, in order to stand up against France, which dominated the Western Mediterranean and was a strong naval power, in order to gain the goals that he sought in the Balkans, and particularly against Yugoslavia, Mussolini needed strong armed forces. His tragedy, if we want to call it that, was that in the 1920s he didn't have them, and nor did he get the first war that he wanted until 1935. The most important of the 3 armed forces in Italy was the army. It was the largest, it had powerful historical traditions that linked it to the king, and throughout this period it took more than half of the budgets. Now, the army in the early 1920s, when Mussolini came to power, was in the hands of conservative Piedmontese military professionals. These men had fought the First World War, and they had come out of it convinced, as indeed they had been before the First World War, that what was needed was a manpower-heavy army. And so during the 1920s, they built up a large conscript force with huge manpower reserves. The problems were twofold. Firstly, this force was skeletal. Large numbers of men went through the barracks, but only for short periods of time, and the question of their military value lay open. Secondly, of course, a force like that is not readily usable in immediate circumstances, or indeed, possibly, against more powerful and better prepared opponents. Mussolini briefly tried to wrench the armed forces out of the hands of these conservative Piedmontese generals in 1924, but he failed. The power of conservatism was too strong, and politically he could not afford to challenge the army. The reason that he couldn't afford to challenge the army was that its loyalty was first and foremost to the king, Victor Emmanuel III, and Mussolini did not want, and certainly did not think at that point, that he could challenge the king for outright dominance. Because of that, the military remained in control. The second force that Mussolini had at his disposal was the navy. Now, the navy shared some, at least, of Mussolini's territorial ambitions. It was said of the chief of the navy, Admiral Paolo Taillon de Revel, at the end of the war, that he suffered from Adriatic scabies. That meant that he had a powerful itch, along with other senior admirals, to possess the eastern coast of the Adriatic, the Dalmatian side of the seaboard. That was chiefly because the equivalent coast of Italy was wide open to the enemy and extremely vulnerable. The navy was also strongly anti-French, as we have seen was Mussolini. They were anti-French because Italy was an enormous peninsula and lay strategically vulnerable to the French navy. They were anti-French because France was building up links with Yugoslavia and Greece, and that threatened to put Italy between two jaws of a vice. They were anti-French because France, with more money, more wealth, could afford to outbuild the Italian navy and was outbuilding it in the 1920s, particularly in cruisers and destroyers and submarines. At this point in time, the navy was as conservative in its way as the army, and it was dominated by battleship admirals. But they were not able to build the kind of ships they wanted because of the international agreement of the Washington Naval Arms Limitation Treaty in 1922. So, for the rest of the 1920s, the Italian Navy set about building fast surface craft, light and heavy cruisers and destroyers, which it thought would enable it at least to try to whittle away French naval supremacy in the Western Mediterranean. The third force at Mussolini's disposal was the Air Force. The Air Force was only created in 1923, and it was created, as Mussolini said himself, because if others are arming in the skies, then we must arm in the skies. But the Air Force had powerful symbolic significance for the fascist regime. After all, it represented the youthful, adventurous, mechanically adept young man of the future that embodied fascist ideals. And it was also, par excellence, the technological arm. And maybe we can add that it was the most visible technological arm. The Italian Navy ships looked elegant when they lay at sea in the Bay of Naples, but not many people could see them. Much more could be made of an Italian Air Force. But it was newly minted in 1923. So Mussolini had to wait while those he'd put in charge of these forces gradually tried to build them up, limited always by Italy's shortage of funds, shortage of raw materials, and also shortage of expert craftsmanship and labour in her factories. Nevertheless, and because of the determination that Mussolini nursed to expand Italian influence and particularly to teach Yugoslavia a lesson, in July 1927, he ordered all three services to undertake systematic preparation for war. The Navy, as we've seen, had limited money, and so it built light ships in order to try to meet this requirement.